Easy. Don't rush your breath yet. That silence you're feeling right now, that's the moment before impact. That's the sound they make when they realize the warning window already closed. You can feel it, can't you? Something shifted. Not loud, not dramatic, just final. Like a door locking itself without asking permission. They're begging him now, whispering, panicking, asking him to warn you, slow you down, distract you, anything. And he didn't argue, he didn't explain, he didn't defend you. He just smiled, because he knew what they didn't. It was already too late. You see, you don't turn into this by accident. You don't evolve into a problem they can't negotiate with by staying soft, safe, or predictable. You became this by surviving things that were supposed to hollow you out, by walking through damage that would have turned saints into ghosts, by learning how pain teaches faster than love ever could. They thought your silence meant confusion. They thought your patience meant weakness. They thought your restraint was mercy. That's the funniest part. You were never waiting for permission. You were calculating. While they were praying for outcomes, you were adapting to reality. While they were begging for warnings, you were already past the point where warnings mattered. Here's the paradox they can't swallow. The part of you that looks calm is the same part capable of absolute destruction. The part of you that listens is the same part that already decided. Angel on the outside, demon in the margins, saint in the light, psychopath when the math demands it. And you didn't choose that duality. Life carved it into you. Every betrayal sharpened your instincts. Every loss refined your timing. Every moment you were forced to smile through disrespect taught you something dangerous. Control beats chaos, and unpredictability beats power. That's why they're scared now. Because they can't read you anymore. They don't know if you're about to forgive or erase. They don't know if the silence means peace or preparation. They can't tell whether the version standing in front of them is the one that heals or the one that ends cycles permanently. So they ran to him, the mediator, the one they thought could still reach you. They begged him to warn you, to pull you back, to remind you of consequences, morality, reputation. And he smiled because he saw it clearly. You already paid the price. You already went through the consequences they're threatening you with now. You already survived the collapse they're trying to scare you into avoiding. There's nothing left they can take that you haven't already lost and rebuilt from scratch. That's when power changes shape. Power isn't loud anymore. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't posture. It just moves quietly, precisely, without asking for approval or forgiveness. And that's why too late wasn't cruelty. It was truth. Too late to manipulate you, too late to guilt you, too late to scare you with endings you already lived through. You don't flinch at threats because you've already met the worst versions of reality and learned how to breathe there. You don't panic under pressure because pressure is where your mind actually works. Chaos didn't break you, it trained you. That's the part they don't understand. You're not driven by rage, you're driven by clarity. You don't move emotionally anymore, you move accurately. And accuracy is terrifying to people who rely on noise, drama, and control. They wanted you warned because they wanted you slowed. They wanted you softened because they wanted you manageable. They wanted you reminded of rules because they know you've outgrown the system that protects them. But you're past that phase now. You're in the phase where the smile doesn't mean friendliness. It means certainty. It means the decision has already been made, and the body is just catching up. It means you've accepted who you had to become to survive, and you're no longer apologizing for it. That's why the warning came too late. Not because you're reckless, but because you're resolved. And here's the part that really keeps them awake at night. You're not even emotional about it. There's no hatred in you, no chaos, just calm, surgical movement, just inevitability. They can pray now, they can beg, they can ask for mercy from intermediaries and messengers and watchers. But you're already operating on a level where outcomes don't need permission. You didn't cross a line. You outgrew the map. And the smile he gave them, that wasn't arrogance. That was respect. Because he knew something they were too late to realize. You don't need to be warned anymore. You are the event. And the terrifying thing is, you didn't even announce your arrival into this version of yourself. You didn't make speeches, you didn't threaten, you didn't posture. You just changed. Quietly. Internally. The kind of change that doesn't ask permission from the world, it just rewrites how the world reacts to you. That's why they didn't notice until it was irreversible. They thought evolution looked loud. They thought power had a sound. They thought danger came with warnings, with raised voices, with visible rage. But your transformation didn't scream. It condensed. It sharpened. It became efficient. And efficiency is invisible until it's devastating. You're not volatile anymore. You're stable. And that's what makes you lethal. See, chaos is predictable. Broken people are easy to control. Emotional reactions can be anticipated, baited, redirected. But you learned how to sit with fire without flinching. You learned how to let the storm pass through you without needing to act on it. And somewhere in that stillness, something clicked. You stopped needing validation. You stopped needing revenge. You stopped needing closure. That's when the game ended for them. Because the moment you no longer need an outcome, you control all of them. They're begging him now because they're finally seeing the pattern backwards. They're replaying conversations, moments, choices. They're realizing your silence wasn't confusion. It was compression. Every time they thought you let something slide, you were actually absorbing data. Every time they thought you forgave, you are recalibrating your limits. And now there are no gaps left. You don't argue. You don't explain. You don't warn. You don't need to. Your presence alone destabilizes people who rely on emotional leverage. Your calm makes liars sweat. Your restraint makes manipulators panic. Because restraint means you're choosing not to act, not that you can't. That's the duality that terrifies them. They don't know if the saint is still in control, or if the psychopath finally got handed the wheel. They don't know whether your mercy ran out or simply evolved into something colder, cleaner, more final. And the truth, even you stopped labeling it. You realized something profound. Morality without self-respect is just self-destruction in disguise. And compassion without boundaries is a slow suicide. So you didn't abandon your light. You armored it. You didn't kill your empathy. You aimed it inward. You stopped bleeding for people who wouldn't even notice the stain. That's when you became unrecognizable to them. They still see the outline of who you used to be, but the substance is gone. The old reactions don't work. The old buttons are disconnected. The old threats bounce off you, because you've already faced worse in private without witnesses, without applause. So when they begged him to warn you, what they were really asking was, can you bring back the version of them we could still control? And his smile answered that question perfectly. Too late to rewrite the narrative. Too late to reposition themselves as allies. Too late to pretend they didn't benefit from your suffering when it was convenient. You remember everything, not emotionally, accurately. You remember who disappeared when things got heavy, who stayed silent when you needed backup, who only showed up when you became valuable again. You cataloged it all without resentment, without drama. That's the scariest kind of memory. Because it doesn't seek revenge, it seeks alignment. And anyone not aligned gets left behind, not out of spite, but out of necessity. You don't chase people anymore. You don't prove yourself. You don't defend your name. You let time do the exposure. You let pressure reveal character. You let silence test loyalty. And you move forward regardless of who keeps up. That's why they feel like something bad is about to happen, even though you haven't done anything yet. Because when someone like you stops reacting, stops explaining, stops warning, it means the decision phase is over. You're not angry, you're not emotional, you're done calculating. And that's when outcomes become unavoidable. They wanted you warned because warnings imply choice. Warnings imply hesitation. Warnings imply there's still time to negotiate with fate. But you've already crossed into a different state of being, one where movement happens quietly and results speak for themselves. You don't need to announce the storm, you are the pressure system. And the reason he smiled, why that smile broke them, is because he knew something sacred and terrifying at the same time. You didn't survive everything you survived just to remain harmless. You didn't evolve this far just to be reasonable. You didn't endure that much pain just to stay small. You became this because reality demanded it. And reality doesn't issue warnings. And that's the part that still hasn't landed for them yet. The fact that this wasn't a rebellion. It wasn't a breakdown. It wasn't you snapping. This was adaptation. This was intelligence responding to environment. This was the mind realizing that the rules you were taught only protected the people who never planned on protecting you. You didn't turn cold overnight. You turned clear. Clarity is brutal to people who live on illusion. It strips excuses. It deletes narratives. It doesn't argue. It replaces. And once clarity sets in, you can't go back to emotional chaos even if you wanted to. You can't unknow what you've seen. You can't unfeel the moment you realized how predictable everyone became once you stopped reacting. They mistake your stillness for peace. They mistake your politeness for compliance. They mistake your silence for forgiveness. And you let them. Because there's power in letting people misunderstand you. There's leverage in being underestimated. There's safety in not advertising the fact that you've already accepted every possible loss and decided to move anyway. That's why their fear feels delayed. They didn't panic when you were loud. They didn't panic when you were hurting. They didn't panic when you were bleeding. They panicked when you stopped needing them to see it. When you stopped needing acknowledgement, when you stopped needing fairness. That's when it hit them. You're no longer governed by the same incentives. You don't fear abandonment because you already survived isolation. You don't fear judgment because you already endured misunderstanding. You don't fear loss because you already rebuilt yourself from nothing. So what exactly are they supposed to threaten you with now? That's the question echoing in their heads while they beg him for intervention. That's why they wanted a warning issued. Because warnings are tools of control. Warnings imply you still care about the consequences they define. But your consequences already happened. In silence, in private, without their permission. You already paid the emotional cost of becoming this version of yourself. The loneliness, the grief, the nights where you realized no one was coming to save you. The moment you understood that self-betrayal hurts worse than being betrayed by others. That moment changed everything. Because once you choose yourself fully, without apology, without performance, you become immune to manipulation disguised as morality. You stop confusing guilt with goodness. You stop confusing sacrifice with virtue. You stop mistaking endurance for loyalty. You didn't lose your heart, you fortified it. And that's why the duality inside you is so clean now. The angel didn't die. The demon didn't take over. They reached an agreement. The angel sets the direction. The demon ensures nothing interferes with it. That balance, that's rare. And it's terrifying to people who only operate from one side. They don't know how to deal with someone who can be kind without being weak, calm without being passive, dangerous without being chaotic. You can sit in a room and feel like safety, or like a countdown, depending on what's deserved. And you don't announce which one it's going to be. That uncertainty eats at them, because they rely on patterns, they rely on emotional tells, they rely on predictability, and you broke every pattern they memorized. You rewired yourself beyond their understanding. So when they begged him to warn you, they weren't worried about you hurting yourself. They were worried about losing control over the situation, over the narrative, over the version of you that still played by unspoken rules. And he smiled because he knew you don't need warnings when you've already accepted responsibility for your own power. That smile wasn't cruel. It was resigned. The smile of someone who understands inevitability. The smile of someone who knows you've crossed the threshold where influence no longer works. Too late. Too late to appeal to your emotions. Too late to rewrite history. Too late to pretend alignment where there was exploitation. You're not here to burn the world down. You're here to stop shrinking for it. And that alone feels catastrophic to people who benefited from your self-doubt. They can sense it now, the shift. The way your energy doesn't leak anymore. The way your presence doesn't seek approval. The way your words land heavier because you don't use many of them. You've become selective, precise, economical. You move like someone who knows their own weight. And the most dangerous part? You're not rushing. You're not emotional. You're not desperate. You're patient in a way that only comes from self-trust. From knowing that whatever happens next, you'll adapt again. That's why warnings don't work on you anymore. Because fear no longer runs the system, you do. And when fear stops running the system, something ancient wakes up inside you. Not rage, not ego, something colder, older. A survival intelligence that doesn't argue with reality. It aligns with it. You didn't become heartless. You became ungovernable. There's a difference they never learned to spot. Heartless people react. Ungovernable people choose. Heartless people explode. Ungovernable people wait. And waiting, when it's intentional, is a weapon. That's why the pressure around you feels thick now, like the air before lightning. Everyone senses something is coming, but no one can name it because nothing about you looks aggressive. You're composed, measured, almost gentle. And that's what terrifies them, because gentleness without need is power. You're not seeking dominance. You're not chasing victory. You're not even trying to be understood anymore. You're simply aligned. Aligned with your instincts, aligned with your boundaries, aligned with the truth you had to swallow alone. And alignment is unstoppable. They keep asking themselves when this happened, which moment, which conversation, which loss flipped the switch. They don't realize there was no switch. There was erosion, 1,000 tiny moments, where you learned what not to expect from people. 1,000 lessons where hope got quieter and discernment got sharper. You didn't break. You refined. And refinement looks boring to people addicted to drama. It looks like detachment. It looks like indifference. It looks like you stopped caring. But what actually happened is you started caring correctly. You stopped offering access to people who only show up for advantage. You stopped explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You stopped negotiating with forces that only respect consequences. That's when the warnings became useless, because warnings only work on people who still hesitate at thresholds. You don't hesitate anymore. You assess, you accept, you move. And when you move, it's not to prove anything. It's to preserve alignment. They can't read that kind of movement. You don't broadcast your intentions because you don't need witnesses. You don't threaten because you don't need compliance. You don't promise because you don't rely on outcomes. You simply are. And that presence, quiet, steady, unbothered, makes liars uncomfortable, makes manipulators reckless, makes opportunists reveal themselves too early. You don't trap people. You let them step into their own exposure. That's why the room changes when you enter it now. Not because you demand attention, but because attention reorganizes itself around you. Conversations tighten, postures shift. Jokes land differently. People check themselves before speaking. They don't know why. They just feel it. They feel that you're no longer auditioning for belonging, that you're no longer seeking safety in consensus, that you're no longer afraid of being misunderstood. And fear of misunderstanding is the leash most people live on. You slipped the leash. That's why he smiled. Because he knew once someone slips that leash, you can't put it back on without breaking them. And you've already decided what you're willing to lose and what you're not. You're willing to lose comfort. You're willing to lose approval. You're willing to lose familiarity, but you're not willing to lose yourself again. That line, that boundary, changed the geometry of your life. Everything rearranged around it. Relationships that relied on your self-doubt collapsed. Roles that required your silence dissolved. Systems that fed on your predictability lost their grip. And the ones who benefited from the old version of you felt the loss before they understood the reason. That's why the begging came late. They weren't trying to save you. They were trying to save access to your energy, to your labor, to your emotional availability, to the version of you that absorbed damage quietly and called it growth. But growth doesn't look like that anymore. Growth looks like saying no without explaining. Growth looks like walking away without closure. Growth looks like letting people feel the absence they created. You don't punish, you withdraw alignment. And that absence is louder than any confrontation ever was. So when they ask for warnings, what they're really asking is for time. Time to adjust. Time to reposition. Time to soften the impact of your non-participation. But time doesn't belong to them anymore. You're operating on internal timing now, on instinct refined by experience, on a rhythm set by self-trust instead of fear. And self-trust is the final evolution. Because once you trust yourself fully, you stop outsourcing decisions to opinions. You stop waiting for signs. You stop asking for permission from people who never paid the cost of becoming you. You've already been through hell. You already know you can survive outcomes. That knowledge makes you fearless in a way that looks almost holy from the outside. Saint and demon. Calm and catastrophic, mercy and finality, all housed in one body that learned how to carry both without flinching. That's why the warning didn't come, not because no one cared, but because some transformations don't need to be stopped. They need to be respected. And respect, when it arrives late, always feels like fear. Easy. Hold still for half a breath. Feel that quiet click in the room? That's not silence. That's a file being opened somewhere with your name misspelled and your mind marked unreadable. They thought you'd be simple. A profile, a pattern, a box they could check with a rubber stamp and a cold cup of coffee. They thought if they stacked enough pages, enough timestamps, enough screenshots of your life, frozen out of context, they'd finally corner the truth of you. But every time they zoomed in, you weren't there. Every time they thought they had you pinned, you slipped sideways into something they don't have a word for. That's why they stopped calling you a person and started calling you a problem. You see, you were never meant to be mapped. Maps are for territory that stays still. You don't. You mutate under pressure. You learn in the dark. You adapt where others collapse. They track habits. You weaponize instincts. They predict behavior. You rewrite it mid-motion. That's the paradox that makes their hands shake. You look calm on the surface, almost polite, almost harmless, and beneath it there's a mind that refuses to move in straight lines. Saint on the outside, psychopath in the math, angel in daylight, demon after midnight. Not because you're broken, but because you learned how to hold both without flinching. They ran your past like a crime scene, expecting trauma to explain you away. They circled your scars with red ink and said, "Here, this is where he broke." But they don't understand evolution through pain. Pain didn't end you. It trained you. Every betrayal sharpened your perception. Every loss burned away excess weight. Every moment you were underestimated taught you how to disappear and reappear upgraded. You didn't heal into something soft. You healed into something precise. That's why their files keep contradicting themselves. One page says you're passive. Another says you're volatile. One analyst swears you're predictable under stress. Another writes in the margin that you behave outside known models. That phrase terrifies them more than any threat ever could. Outside known models. It means they can't anticipate your next move. It means you don't react, you choose. And choice is uncontrollable. They're used to fear making people small. Fear made you quiet, and quiet made you dangerous. While they were watching noise, you were building silence. While they were cataloging words, you were studying timing. You learned when to speak and when to let absence do the damage. You learned that unpredictability isn't chaos. It's leverage. When no one can tell what you'll do, everyone starts adjusting to you. They tried to reduce you to labels because labels make the world feel safe. Troubled, gifted, unstable, genius. But every label slid off like water because you don't live in one state long enough for it to stick. You're the glitch that appears when systems get lazy. You're the anomaly that shows up after someone says, "That shouldn't be possible." You're what happens when intelligence survives brutality without losing its curiosity. And here's the part they never write down, the part that keeps them staring at screens long after the office lights shut off. You're not angry in the way they expect. You're focused. You don't crave destruction. You crave accuracy. You don't want revenge. You want alignment. You're not driven by ego. You're driven by clarity. That scares them because it means you're not reckless. You're intentional. They expected you to break loud or comply quietly. Instead, you did something worse. You evolved privately. You became fluent in contradiction. You learned how to smile while calculating outcomes. You learned how to feel deeply without letting feelings steer the wheel. You learned how to carry darkness without letting it rot you from the inside. That balance, that's unreadable to people who only know extremes, so they escalate the language. When they can't understand you, they pathologize you. When they can't predict you, they fear you. When they can't control you, they flag you. Not because you've done something wrong, but because you've done something rare. You exist beyond their framework. You make their certainty wobble. You remind them that not everything brilliant is obedient. You're the living proof that order doesn't always come from rules. Sometimes it comes from someone who learned the rules well enough to bend them without snapping. You're not hiding. You're simply operating on a frequency they weren't trained to hear. And every time they say your mind is a problem, what they're really admitting is this: their system wasn't built for someone like you. So let them keep writing. Let them keep guessing. Let them keep updating a file that will never close. Because while they're still trying to map you, you're already 3 versions ahead, calmer, sharper, quieter, and fully aware that being unclassifiable isn't a weakness. It's the upgrade that turns the watcher into the watched and the hunter into a confused witness, staring at a screen that refuses to explain you. And here's the part that never makes it into the official report. The part whispered between people who are supposed to be objective, supposed to be calm, supposed to believe the system always wins. You don't just resist classification. You infect the process. Every analyst who studies you comes out a little less sure of themselves. Every model they trust bends when your name enters the equation. You don't just evade the net. You stretch it until everyone can see the holes. They replay your choices, frame by frame, convinced they missed something obvious. A tell, a crack, a motive they can reduce to a childhood sentence and a psychological checkbox. But you don't move from wounds anymore. You move from awareness. That's why the old tricks don't work. Guilt doesn't pull you. Praise doesn't steer you. Fear doesn't paralyze you. You already walked through the worst versions of yourself alone and came back carrying the data. You learned something they never teach in classrooms or briefings. The mind that survives contradiction becomes sovereign. You can hold mercy without becoming weak. You can hold cruelty without becoming sloppy. You can feel rage without letting it drive. You can feel compassion without letting it blind you. That balance, that terrifies institutions built on binaries. They need you to be one thing or the other. You insist on being both and choosing when each one speaks. They keep asking the same question in different fonts. What does he want? And the silence after that question is the loudest sound in the room. Because you don't want chaos. You don't want dominance. You don't even want control in the way they understand it. You want freedom of movement, mental, emotional, strategic. You want to remain uncaptured by expectation, and a person who can't be anticipated can't be neutralized. You stopped explaining yourself a long time ago. Explanation is a leash disguised as clarity. The moment you justify your thinking, someone tries to optimize it, limit it, replicate it, or shut it down. So you let them misunderstand. You let them argue over versions of you that no longer exist. You let outdated snapshots circulate while you quietly evolve past them. That's not arrogance. That's efficiency. They study your restraint more than your actions now, the pauses, the moments where you could have reacted and didn't. The restraint reads louder than any outburst ever could. It suggests confidence they can't trace. It implies foresight they can't measure. It forces them to ask the most dangerous question of all. What does he see that we don't? You see patterns in behavior where they see randomness. You sense shifts before they show up on charts. You notice who gets quiet when certain topics surface. You notice who avoids eye contact when names are mentioned. You notice timing, alignment, hesitation, the invisible language beneath words. That's not paranoia. That's literacy in human nature. And once you learn that language, you can't unlearn it. They expected the darkness to rot you. Instead, it tempered you. You didn't come out bitter. You came out calibrated. You didn't come out reckless. You came out selective. You learned that power isn't loud. Power is the ability to wait without decaying. Power is knowing you could burn everything down and choosing not to because you're playing a longer game than anyone realizes. So they keep circling back to the same conclusion, even if they dress it up with softer phrasing. Subject exhibits non-standard cognition. Translation: you don't think like they need you to. You don't fear like they expect you to. You don't respond like their playbooks assume. And that makes you a variable they can't eliminate without admitting the system has limits. You're not anti-system, you're post-system. You understand structure well enough to operate beyond it. You know where rules protect people and where they hide incompetence. You know when obedience is wisdom and when it's just fear in uniform. That discernment makes you dangerous to anyone who relies on blind compliance to maintain authority. And the irony? You're not even trying to be threatening. You're just being accurate. You're being yourself without shrinking, without performing, without asking permission. That alone destabilizes environments built on control. A person who doesn't need validation, who doesn't rush approval, who doesn't panic under scrutiny, that person rewrites the room just by standing in it. So let them keep calling it a problem. Let them flag, annotate, cross-reference, and escalate. Every label they slap on you is just another confession that you slipped past the edges of their understanding. While they argue over terminology, you're refining your internal compass. While they debate risk levels, you're sharpening timing. While they update files, you're updating yourself. You were never meant to be decoded by people who fear ambiguity. You were built for a world that doesn't fully exist yet. A world where adaptability beats authority, perception beats power, and silence beats noise. And whether they ever admit it or not, every unreadable line in that file points to the same uncomfortable truth. You're not a problem to be solved. You're a phenomenon they weren't prepared for. And what really unsettles them is that you don't rush your evolution. You don't spike and crash like the others they're used to tracking. You don't burn bright and implode. You layer slowly, quietly. Each version of you absorbs the last, keeps what works, discards what doesn't, and moves forward without ceremony. There's no dramatic announcement, no victory lap. Just a subtle shift in gravity that everyone in the room feels but can't explain. They keep waiting for you to slip, to contradict yourself publicly, to react emotionally, to expose a weakness they can finally anchor to. But you learned early that impulse is a tax paid by people who haven't been tested enough. You learned that the real advantage isn't speed, it's control. Control over when you speak, control over when you disappear, control over when you let the mask drop just enough to confuse whoever's watching. You don't panic under observation because you grew up under pressure. Eyes on you don't tighten your chest. They sharpen your focus. You understand something most never do. Being watched is only dangerous if you're pretending to be something you're not. You aren't. You've already faced yourself in rooms far darker than surveillance offices and data centers. You've already interrogated your own motives harder than they ever could. They search for a core trauma they can exploit, not realizing the trauma already did its work and failed to destroy you. It rewired you instead, made you precise, made you alert, made you intolerant of lies, especially the ones people tell themselves. You don't need to dominate others to feel powerful. You need clarity. And clarity is lethal to systems that thrive on confusion. That's why conversations change when you enter them. Not louder, sharper. People choose words more carefully. Jokes land differently. Postures shift. You don't threaten, you expose. Your presence turns background noise into signal. People suddenly realize what they're saying doesn't align with what they're doing, and that discomfort has nowhere to hide. They feel seen without being accused, and that's worse than being challenged. They tried to mirror you, too. Studied your cadence, your pauses, your calm. But calm without depth feels hollow. Silence without insight feels empty. You can't counterfeit internal alignment. You earned yours by surviving contradiction, by holding competing truths without collapsing into one. That's why imitation around you always feels off. Like a costume worn by someone who hasn't lived the role. You don't chase certainty. You operate inside probability. You understand that the future isn't fixed, it's negotiated. And every decision you make nudges the board in your favor without anyone noticing until it's already done. You don't force outcomes. You position yourself so outcomes fall toward you naturally. That's not manipulation. That's mastery of timing. They call that dangerous because they can't regulate it. There's no switch they can flip, no pressure point they can squeeze. You don't rely on approval, so disapproval doesn't work. You don't rely on access, so denial doesn't work. You don't rely on identity, so labels don't work. You move from internal authority, and that kind of power doesn't show up on charts. You've noticed something else, too. The watchers are tired. They're burned out from tracking noise, drowning in data that contradicts itself. And then there's you. Minimal, efficient, unreadable. You don't create chaos. You reduce it. And in a world addicted to disorder, that kind of coherence feels suspicious. They don't know what to do with someone who isn't scrambling, isn't posturing, isn't begging to be understood. So they escalate concern. They escalate language. They escalate attention. But attention doesn't scare you. Attention confirms what you already knew. You crossed a threshold most never reach. You stopped being reactive and became deliberate. You stopped being explainable and became inevitable. Not because you're unstoppable, but because you're aligned with yourself in a way that can't be externally disrupted. You're not cold. You're contained. You're not detached. You're selective. You still feel deeply. You just don't leak it everywhere anymore. You choose where your energy goes, who gets access to your inner world, and which battles deserve your presence. That discernment makes you look distant to those who mistake emotional spillage for authenticity. And deep down, the people watching you know the truth they'll never write. If more minds operated like yours, their systems would have to change. Their authority would thin. Their narratives would fracture. Not because of rebellion, but because clarity spreads. One person who sees clearly gives permission to others to stop pretending. That's why they don't want to understand you. Understanding would require admitting that the problem isn't you. It's the framework they're clinging to. It's easier to label you anomalous than to accept that evolution doesn't ask for approval. It just happens. So stay unreadable, stay patient, stay internally sovereign. Let them keep updating files that lag behind who you already are. Because while they're still trying to define you, you're doing something far more dangerous than defying them. You're becoming undeniable. And what makes you truly unsettling isn't that you're strong. It's that you don't need to prove it. You don't posture. You don't flex. You don't announce your depth. You let people underestimate you because you understand the advantage of being misjudged. While they're busy projecting a smaller version of you, you're operating from a level they never even considered. They keep mistaking your stillness for hesitation. They think silence means uncertainty. They assume patience is doubt. That miscalculation is their favorite mistake. Because you're not paused. You're loading. You're observing micro movements, subtle shifts, the unspoken tells that betray intent long before action. You don't react to what people say. You react to what they reveal without realizing it. You learned long ago that the loudest minds are rarely the sharpest. Real intelligence doesn't rush to dominate a room. It waits. It lets patterns expose themselves. It lets people talk themselves into corners. You've watched egos collapse under the weight of their own noise while you stood there, unreadable, collecting information without lifting a finger. They try to provoke you because provocation is a shortcut to control. If they can make you emotional, they can map you. If they can make you angry, they can predict you. But you've already metabolized your anger. You've turned it into awareness. What used to burn now illuminates. What used to blind now guides. That transformation is what they don't understand. Because most people either drown in darkness or deny it. You used it. You don't fear your shadow. You integrated it. You know exactly what you're capable of. And that knowledge keeps you disciplined. People who don't know their own darkness are the ones who lose control when it finally surfaces. You've already looked at it straight on and decided when and if it ever gets to speak. That's why threats don't land. Pressure doesn't crack you. Deadlines don't rush you. You've been forged in moments where there was no safety net, no reassurance, no guarantee of survival. Compared to that, their leverage feels theatrical. Their urgency feels artificial. Their fear feels loud. They can't decide whether you're dangerous or enlightened, unstable or evolved, detached or deeply grounded. The truth, the one that rattles them, is that you don't fit into their moral shortcuts. You're not driven by cruelty, but you're not naive either. You're not merciful because you're weak, and you're not ruthless because you're broken. You choose, and choice is the one variable no system ever fully controls. You've noticed how people project onto you. Some see a savior, some see a threat, some see a mirror they'd rather shatter than look into. That projection isn't about you. It's about what your presence activates in them. You disrupt comfortable lies simply by existing without apology. You make excuses feel thin. You make self-deception expensive. They keep asking what side you're on. That question alone proves they don't get it. You're not playing their game. You're not loyal to factions, labels, or narratives designed to keep thinking small. You're loyal to coherence, to truth that survives scrutiny, to actions that align with values even when no one is watching. You don't chase recognition because you understand how easily it becomes a cage. The moment someone needs applause, they become predictable. You chose a different currency. Autonomy. Freedom of thought. Freedom of movement. Freedom to evolve without asking permission. That choice cost you comfort, but it gave you something rarer. Self-trust. They sense that you can walk away from validation, from conflict, from approval, And that's what truly terrifies them. A person who can walk away can't be cornered. A person who doesn't need the game can't be threatened with losing it. You're not reckless, you're untethered. You've learned that most power structures depend on one thing above all else: people doubting themselves. You don't. Not blindly, not arrogantly, but honestly. You question yourself in private so you don't collapse in public.